After the gunshot that took President Lincoln's life in 1865, John Wilkes Booth attempted to flee to Virginia with a broken leg but ultimately failed to escape. On the evening of April 14, 1865, 26-year-old actor John Wilkes Booth quietly entered Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His presence did not raise any suspicions, as Booth frequently performed there. He even used the theater's address for his mail, because he did not have a permanent residence in the city. Shortly after 10 p.m., Booth approached President Abraham Lincoln's private box, while Lincoln was intently watching a play. Booth locked the door behind him to prevent anyone else from entering. He waited patiently, knowing there would be a loud laugh from the audience at a humorous moment in the play. As expected, when the audience burst into laughter, Booth stepped up to President Lincoln with a small pistol, aimed at his head, and fired. The assassination occurred towards the end of the American Civil War, which was fought between the Union, Northern states, and the Confederacy, Southern states. After Lincoln was elected president in 1860, 11 Southern states that practiced slavery declared secession and formed the Confederacy. The remaining 25 states supported the Union. Booth, along with several others, supported the Confederacy and aimed to kill the three most important officials of the Union: President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William H. Seward. After witnessing Lincoln get shot, Major Henry Rathbone, who was seated near the president, tried to restrain Booth, but was stabbed in the arm by the actor. Booth then jumped from the box, breaking his leg upon landing. Despite his injury, Booth quickly stood up and ran across the stage. Many in the audience initially believed Booth was part of the play and did not react. It was only after First Lady Mary Lincoln and Rathbone screamed "Stop him!" that people rushed to apprehend Booth, but he had already escaped through a side door and fled on horseback. Half an hour later, Booth crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. His escape nearly ended when a guard stopped him, as civilians were prohibited from crossing the bridge after 9 p.m. However, Booth calmly provided his identity and explained he needed to return home to a nearby town, convincing the guard to let him pass. Booth met up with David Harold, 23, his accomplice in the plot to kill the Union officials, on the way to Surrattsville, Maryland, about 8 miles from Ford's Theater. They stopped at a tavern to retrieve weapons, binoculars, ammunition, and a bottle of whiskey they had arranged with the tavern keeper. On the second day of their escape, April 15th, around 4 a.m., they arrived at the home of a doctor. The doctor splinted Booth's broken leg and allowed the two men to rest at his house, without knowing their true identities. Meanwhile, approximately 15 miles away, at 7:22 a.m., doctors declared President Lincoln dead at the age of 56. Booth had achieved one of his three objectives. His accomplices failed to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward as planned. On the morning of April 16th, Booth shaved off his mustache to disguise himself and left the doctor's house. The two then made their way to the home of Samuel Cox, a Confederate sympathizer. Recognizing the danger, Cox refused to let the men stay in his house but directed them to hide in a nearby pine thicket, promising someone would come to assist them. Thomas Jones, a Confederate agent, eventually met Booth and Harold in the pine thicket. Jones brought food, whiskey, and newspapers, which Booth was eager to read. He wanted to know how the country was reacting to his actions. Jones advised the two men to wait before crossing the Potomac River into Virginia, explaining that Union troops were in the area and moving from their hiding spot would be dangerous. This news, and his worsening leg, caused Booth considerable discomfort. On April 19th, while President Lincoln's funeral took place in the East Room of the White House, Booth and Harold remained in the pine thicket near Rich Hill. They grew impatient, but heeded Jones's warning. They also had plenty of whiskey to keep themselves occupied. On April 20th, at sunset, Jones guided Booth and Harold to the Potomac River to board a boat. The two became disoriented in the darkness and fog but managed to evade a Union gunboat. After several hours of rowing in the cold, they reached Virginia on April 23rd. On April 24th, Booth and Harold arrived at the farm of Richard Garrett, a tobacco farmer. Booth claimed to be a wounded Confederate soldier in need of shelter and was taken in. One of the largest manhunts in U.S. history was underway to capture Booth, with thousands of soldiers deployed and civilians actively participating. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton personally directed the operation, offering a $50,000 reward, equivalent to $900,000 today, for information leading to Booth's capture. Booth woke up late on April 25, his 12th day on the run. Exhausted, he was awakened by Garrett's son. Booth had breakfast and rewarded himself with a glass of whiskey. He also played with the Garrett children, who grew suspicious and questioned Booth again. He stuck to his story. The two men asked to stay one more night but were not allowed to sleep in the house as they had the previous night. The Garretts directed them to sleep in the tobacco barn on their property. At 2:30 a.m. on April 26, the 16th New York Cavalry of the Union surrounded the farm. It is unclear if the Garrett family had informed on them, but they did not obstruct the cavalry. David Harold immediately surrendered. Booth did not. The cavalry set the barn on fire. "I will not be taken alive," Booth shouted, armed with a rifle and a pistol, as he headed for the barn's back door. Sergeant Boston Corbett approached from behind the barn and shot Booth in the back of the head. The actor collapsed and was carried outside by soldiers. "Tell my mother I died for my country," Booth told the soldiers. The cavalry tried to give Booth water, but he could not swallow. The officers noted that Booth's pulse grew weaker. Staring at his hands, Booth uttered his final words, "Useless, useless." The actor died about 3 hours after being shot. Sergeant Corbett was initially arrested for disobeying Secretary of War Stanton's order to capture Booth alive, but was later released. The media and the public hailed Corbett as a hero. David Harold was tried and hanged. For Corbett, the moment after Booth was shot was unforgettable. "When Booth lay before me, I saw the bullet had struck almost the exact spot where he had shot Mr. Lincoln, and I thought to myself, what goes around, comes around."